A strategic failure for Vladimir Putin. That's how Serbian media today describe the outcome of the meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić. On August 8th, Volodymyr Zelensky made the first visit by a Ukrainian president to Serbia in the history of this war. A country that for decades was considered Moscow's closest ally in the Balkans. And now, the Swiss publication NZZ called this a violation of a political taboo and a strategic failure for Vladimir Putin. But on the very same day, Vucic himself publicly denied that military cooperation with Ukraine was discussed at all during his meeting with Zelensky. That is, he was quick to backtrack. That's why it's important to be very careful with our assessment here, because Aleksandar Vucic can trivialize things and use Volodymyr Zelensky's visit for his own personal interests against the backdrop of a serious political crisis in Serbia itself. In this episode, we'll break down what really happened and, most importantly, whether we can talk about Serbia turning toward Ukraine and Europe, or if Belgrade is simply once again playing its long-standing double game. On the other hand, against the backdrop of news that Turkey has started selling ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, which we discussed in the previous episode, it is worth remembering that earlier Aleksandar Vučić confirmed that Belgrade is indeed selling weapons to its Western partners, fully understanding that these weapons are then supplied to Ukraine. My name is Alexei Peci. Let's analyze together the results of Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Serbia, what he discussed with Aleksandar Vučić, and what all this means for Ukraine and Serbia. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're moving towards the 300,000 subscriber mark, so I would appreciate every subscription and every like from you. So, to set the tone for this episode right away, I want to share a quote from the Swiss publication NZZ describing Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Belgrade today. Because it's telling, but it can be somewhat misleading. Quote, Belgrade's decision to welcome Moscow's biggest opponent is a violation of a political taboo. Although Vucic, when announcing the meeting, made it clear that Serbia will stick to its policy toward Russia and will not join the sanctions for now, he also emphasized the potential for cooperation with, quote, Let me remind you, since the very beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Serbia has been trying to balance between Moscow and the West. Belgrade recognizes the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but at the same time has not joined the European Union's sanctions against Russia. But behind the facade of good intentions towards Ukraine, Vucic has his own and not even very well hidden motive. To demonstrate to his people, or more precisely to a part of the electorate, his willingness to engage in dialogue with the West and even with Ukraine. Vucic urgently needs to show that he is supposedly on the same page as the European Union, but at the same time, he hasn't become outright pro-Ukrainian. The fact is that Serbia has been an official candidate for joining the European Union since 2012, whereas Ukraine received that status only 10 years later, but has surpassed Serbia in the pace of reforms. Belgrade's negotiations on joining the EU have been at a standstill for years. Brussels criticizes Serbia for problems with the rule of law, the lack of progress on Kosovo, and the unwillingness to join sanctions against Russia. Therefore, the meeting with Zelensky could be a signal to the West that Serbia is ready for closer cooperation. Ukraine's position on Kosovo also plays an important role. The fact is that Kyiv does not officially recognize the independence of the former Serbian province, and Vucic does not hide that he views Ukraine's position positively. This is a rare case, where the interests of the two countries actually coincide directly. Western media note that among the possible topics of the meeting between Zelensky and Vucic is covert cooperation in the defense sector and joint production of drones. According to the German publication Frankfurter Allgemeine, Serbia, Ukraine, and the United Arab Emirates may create a trilateral model of cooperation in the field of drone technology development. And this could really become a breakthrough. The parties also intend to finalize a free trade agreement and cooperate in the energy sector. And here is the final assessment of Zelensky's visit to Serbia from the Swiss publication NZZ, and it sounds tough. The summit in Belgrade is a strategic failure for Putin. Zelensky is now sitting at the negotiating table with Moscow's most important ally in the Balkans. For Kyiv, this is a symbolic victory. Ukraine is managing to encroach on Russia's sphere of influence. But there is still something that seriously clouds this beautiful picture of the meeting between Zelensky and Vucic. Aleksandar Vučić himself was quick to publicly deny that issues of military cooperation between Serbia and Ukraine were raised at the meeting with Zelensky. He said, right now, definitely not. And what will happen after the war ends, according to Vucic, is a completely different question. So, on that same day, after Western media had already called Zelensky's visit a strategic blow to Putin, personally disavowed the most sensitive part of this interpretation, the topic of joint weapons production, but immediately hinted that the deal might concern the future, not today. But it is also telling that the Serbian opposition party considered Zelensky's visit to Belgrade as a threat to relations with Russia. So even within Serbia itself, there is no unified opinion that what is happening is beneficial for Serbia. But this indicates that the Serbs have started their election campaign. I'm not saying this for no reason. The fact is that the president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, announced back in June that he would step down from his position as president within the next week and called for early presidential and parliamentary elections. This statement came against the backdrop of more than a year and a half of ongoing mass student protests across the country. But the thing is, even if Vučić doesn't step down himself, his second and final presidential term will end in the spring of 2027 anyway. Therefore, it is possible that Zelensky's visit could be used by Vucic's party for pre-election propaganda, claiming that his party is ready to go in step with Brussels' policy. But that doesn't mean that Vucic will go beyond the usual rhetoric. But we'll discuss that a little later. Now let's talk about what Vucic said directly about the war itself, and this also doesn't sound like the rhetoric of a country that has fully aligned itself with Ukraine. After meeting with Zelensky, Vucic stated that he does not see any ways for a quick end to Russia's war against Ukraine. He emphasized that Serbia and the international community are striving for peace, but he himself is not confident that the conflict will end soon. And there may be another difficult winter ahead, both for Ukrainians and for other countries around the world. This echoes his earlier and, by the way, much more alarming statements, because earlier Vucic said that it would be difficult to prevent a third world war. And it may have already effectively begun because of the global struggle for resources. He emphasized that Russia is unlikely to be able to win the war against Ukraine, but it also cannot lose it. After all, a state that possesses nuclear weapons cannot be defeated by military means. Vucic also warned about the risk of using tactical nuclear weapons in regional conflicts. And he noted that many countries are simply buying time now, gaining time as they prepare for larger-scale clashes. And now pay attention to the very framing of these statements by Vucic. This isn't about being pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. It's an openly neutral, fatalistic stance. It's the language of a person who tries not to take anyone's side, but it's getting harder for him to keep playing both sides. But it's also important to remember that Vucic's ties with Putin haven't gone anywhere either. Let me remind you that in May of this year, less than 3 months before Zelensky's visit, Vucic sent Vladimir Putin a congratulatory letter for Victory Day on May 9th through the Russian ambassador. He talked about how the Russian soldier is impossible to defeat. Thank you to the Red Army and so on. And earlier, he publicly stated that imposing sanctions against Russia means, quote, betraying the soul of his people. This is a wording, a formulation that's hard to reconcile with the image of a leader turning his back on Putin and facing Zelensky and the West. At the same time, it's important to be precise and not fall into the other extreme, as if Serbia is just a puppet of Moscow. In reality, Serbia has been producing, selling, and transferring weapons to Ukraine for years, unlike, for example, Hungary, which is not a supplier of weapons to Kiev at all. But still, Serbia tried for some time to pretend that it was neither with Moscow nor with Brussels. That's why. But Serbia did this quite cleverly. And I should note that Russia put a lot of pressure on Alexander Vucic specifically because of these arms supplies, but he still managed to maneuver skillfully, played dumb, and so on. The official position of Belgrade is as follows: Serbia does not supply weapons to the armed forces of Ukraine directly and intentionally, but Serbian military products can end up in Ukraine through other countries. And Vucic himself did not hide this. So the scheme is very simple. They produce ammunition, they sell them to some country in Europe. This country in Europe then transfers all of it to Ukraine. So the idea is that Serbia simply doesn't deliver anything directly, but still keeps selling these shells onward, and they end up in Ukraine. And here we come back to politics again. The logic behind Alexander Vucic's dual approach is very simple. Roughly half of Serbia's population, which is mostly the older generation, sympathizes with Russia. Vucic can't ignore these sentiments. Otherwise, he simply won't be able to stay in power. That's why there's this constant balancing act. These are the public letters to Putin. But weapons are quietly sent to Ukraine through third countries, so that Brussels also appreciates such a move. Because you have to understand that not everyone in Serbia is pro-Russian. There are also pro-European and even pro-Ukrainian citizens. That's why Vucic needs to do his best to balance between these groups of voters. And the last, but extremely important point, Vucic himself is not in the strongest domestic political position right now, once again. Back at the end of June 2026, amid massive anti-government protests, he publicly announced that he would resign and call early presidential and parliamentary elections. According to him, this should happen within the next few weeks. The formal reason for the protests, let me remind you, is the incident of the canopy collapse at the railway station in Novi Sad, which claimed the lives of 16 people. After that, the protesters accused Alexander Vucic's ruling Serbian Progressive Party of systemic corruption and ineffective governance. They said that the entire station back then, in short, was reconstructed, but the canopy over the entrance was only repaired on paper. As a result, it collapsed and unfortunately claimed the lives of 16 people. At the same time, Vucic himself stated that he is confident he will remain in politics and maintain his influence even after formally stepping down as president. And now Alexander Vucic is considering becoming prime minister. He can't be president anymore because his 2 terms are over. And at the same time, the opposition Green Left Front, that's what it's called, is openly stating that they believe this whole story with Vucic's resignation and the elections is just a way for him to distract public attention and to create new reasons for political maneuvering. And in some ways the opposition is right. The elections are already scheduled for the fall of 2026, and the official term of Vucic's presidency, even if he didn't resign early, would only expire in the spring of 2027. So, in any case, he doesn't have much time left in power. And that leads to a fairly logical conclusion. It seems that the meeting with Zelensky is primarily beneficial for Vucic himself, especially at a time when his political position within the country is very shaky. A symbolic gesture of rapprochement with the West and with Ukraine. It's a way to show Brussels and his own voters, who are oriented toward European integration rather than Russia, that under Vucic, Serbia is moving in the right direction, while at the same time not sacrificing its real ties with Moscow, which he demonstratively reaffirmed on the same day, by denying military cooperation and talking about the invincibility of Russia as a nuclear power. So, the meeting between Vucic and Zelensky is symbolic, and I would say a carefully measured gesture. Yes, this is the Ukrainian president's first visit since the war began. These are talks about trade, energy, and even potential drone production in the future. But there is no progress on the main issue. Sanctions against Russia, which Belgrade still hasn't imposed, and judging by Vucic's rhetoric, doesn't plan to impose. So at the end of the segment, I'll say this. The meeting with Zelensky is a move that primarily boosts Alexander Vucic's image with Brussels and among his own voters, and not the beginning of a real geopolitical reorientation of Serbia. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.